Chapter 26 is the start of our look into exam 2 material. So chapter 26 and 27 are going to cover exam 2, and we start looking at how things started to colonize land. So we know that at one time everything probably lived underwater, and water probably encompassed more of the earth than it does now. Um, and so everything pretty much generated from the water, but eventually those things moved above the water surface and started to try to colonize the ground. And we believe that some of the first things that did that were going to be plants before they were animals. So for more than the first 2 billion years of Earth's history, the terrestrial surface was lifeless. So what was on it? Minerals, rocks, that kind of thing most likely. But there weren't any plants, which is very difficult for us to imagine because all we know is that there are plants and living things that just teem around the earth. Cyanobacteria and protists likely existed on the land 1.2 billion years ago. And then around 500 years ago, small plants, fungi, and animals started to move onto the land. So we have not really been, as far as time-wise, how long the earth has existed, for a very, very short period of time, animals, plants, things have not been living on land. The first forests were probably formed around 385 million years ago also. And so while plants and fungus aren't really that closely related, um, they started to colonize the land before animals did. And if you really think about it, that makes a lot of sense because otherwise what were animals going to feed on? Yes, there were probably a whole lot of predators, but there were still those that were omnivores, or maybe there were some that were just herbivores. So we had to have a food source and also an oxygen source before um, consumers moved on to land. So as you probably learned in very basic elementary science, plants of course supply oxygen, and although we do eat a lot of meat, really most land animals consume plants over anything else. Fungi break down organic material and recycle the nutrients. So things like mushrooms are a fungi that we can easily see and understand. And while we might consume that, there's also a lot of spores and things that are fungus that help recycle items. So instead of having trash piled up above the ground or underneath the surface of the soil, when insects die, when plants die, when other matter dies, something has to decompose that. Otherwise, it would build up and build up and build up, and we would just be living on a heap of trash. So fungus is pretty important. We're only going to cover sections 26.1 and 26.4. And if you're doing the dynamic study modules, you'll find that I don't really have a whole lot of control. It's all or nothing basically. So when you do those dynamic study modules, there's going to be a lot of material in there that we aren't really going to necessarily cover. And don't let that worry you or stress you out or anything. Some of the information is good. The rest of it just kind of guess on. And then the homework is going to be relatively short because I kind of had to pull some stuff and try to get things that fit into what concepts 26.1 and 26.4 really were. But when you get to the quiz and to the exam, it's going to exclusively cover that information. So fossils showed that plants colonized the land a little over 470 million years ago. And what we believe are the closest relatives to land plants, plants that we recognize today, is a type of green algae called a charophyte. So a lot of characteristics that you see in land plants also appear in some fungi, and in some algae, and that's one reason why we believe that they are related to one another. But there's also land plants share certain distinctive traits that only charophytes, and not with other algae. So we kind of believe that land plants evolved from a common ancestor that produced charophytes and land plants. Those traits that are only found in charophytes that land plants also possess are rings of cellulose synthesizing complexes. So these little rings that make cellulose, right? and then the structure of flagellated sperm, which we also see in animals. So also if we compare nuclear and chloroplast genes to charophytes, we find them that the closest living relatives of the charophytes are land plants. But if you look well, another slide or so down, you'll also see that land plants are not descended from modern charophytes, but they share a common ancestor with them. So as plants started to move onto land, they obviously had to develop a lot of different types of adaptations, mainly overcoming the idea that they're going to dry out, right? If you're constantly underwater and there's moisture all around you, then you've got to find a way to come above ground. Whether it's a wet environment or a moist environment or not, it's obviously going to be a lot drier than it was when they were submerged under the ground. So charophytes, we start to see this layer. It's called a sporopollenin, and it prevented the zygotes, which are the male and the female sperm, or male or female gametes, right? The things that would be akin to sperm and eggs in mammals, from drying out. And that sporopollenin is also found in the plant spore walls, So we know if they're sharing this very unique, very adapted trait, then the charophytes and the plants have got to be somewhat related. So the movement onto land by charophyte ancestors provided unfiltered sunlight, and a lot more CO2 and a very nutrient-rich soil. But it also presented some challenges. So there's not as much water, and their bodies don't have structural support. In water, it's kind of like no gravity, right? They're floating, and so they're able to have some structural support. Well, now they're either going to have to be shorter, smaller plants close to the ground, or they're going to have to adapt a way to have a harder outside that allows them to grow up. Think about how hard the trunk of a tree is. It's amazing how tall some of these trees can get without falling over. So they have to have immense structural support within them. The accumulation of traits that facilitated survival on land may have also opened the way to colonization by plants. Systematics are currently debating the boundaries of the plant kingdom, and this changes every time a new book is published. A little more is changed each time. So you're taking this class now. If, say, you end up getting a degree in biology or botany or horticulture, and then you end up teaching a biology, botany, horticulture class sometime in the future, chances are what you learn today is going to be different than what you're teaching your students. And so right now we kind of define plants as these things called embryophytes, which are plants that contain an embryo. And we'll look a little bit more at them. So you can see that so we had this algae ancestor making way to red algae and chlorophytes. And then we have a common ancestor here that produced other charophytes, and then the closest charophyte relative, which we have a common ancestor right here with embryophytes. And embryophytes are what we consider all plants to be. So key traits that appear in nearly all plants but are absent in the charophytes, which let us know that charophytes have to be off on their own branch, like these guys are, instead of grouped with us, is this thing called alternation of generations. We'll look at that in just a second. Multicellular and dependent embryos, walled spores that produce sporangia, and then this thing called an apical meristem. So alternation of generations is where the gametophyte is haploid and it produces haploid gametes by mitosis. And then those two gametes, so you have this thing called a gametophyte. It's haploid, meaning it only has one chromosome, right? It's not diploid where it has two. And it produces haploid gametes by mitosis. So it kind of makes clones of itself a little bit, right? And we call those gametes. Those gametes will fuse and make a diploid, which becomes a sporophyte, and that will produce haploid spores by mitosis. So you go from haploid to diploid to haploid to diploid, right? And that's where you get the name of alternation of generations. So let's just wonder if we can. Here we go.
A haploid fern spore settles on moist ground. It germinates and develops into a tiny, heart-shaped haploid gametophyte that sustains itself by photosynthesis.
And is also haploid.
Archegonia, the structures that produce eggs, develop on the underside of the gametophyte. Antheridia, also located on the underside of the gametophyte, produce sperm. Since the gametophyte is haploid, eggs and sperm are produced by mitosis. Sperm swim through moisture from an antheridium to an archegonium, usually on another gametophyte. An egg is fertilized, forming a diploid zygote. The zygote grows into the large, conspicuous diploid sporophyte that we identify as a fern. Spots called sori on the undersides of fern leaves are actually clusters of sporangia. In a sporangium, diploid cells undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. The spores settle on the ground and develop into a new generation of fern gametophytes.
Okay, so that was just trying to give you kind of a animation to show you the movement or this alternation of generations. You're haploid and then diploid, haploid and then diploid. And that is a fern life cycle, which we consider to be a little bit more of a primitive, it's a non-vascular seed plant. And then you also have moss life cycle. So this is also a seedless plant. Both of these require a lot of, you don't find ferns in environments that aren't extremely moist, right? So we haven't totally broken away from the need for water. And what you'll see in both of these is that water is what helps them reproduce. So just look at the moss real quick.
Haploid gametophytes are the most conspicuous stage in the moss life cycle, the spongy green plants we see covering moist ground or fallen logs. Vase-shaped archegonia, the structures that produce eggs, develop at the tips of female gametophytes. Antheridia, which produce sperm, develop on the tops of male gametophytes. Because the gametophyte stage is haploid, eggs and sperm are produced by mitosis in the archegonia and antheridia. Sperms swim through moisture from antheridia and fertilize eggs in the archegonia. A diploid fertilized egg, called a zygote, develops into an embryo, which grows into a sporophyte, a tall filament with a sporangium at its tip. The sporophyte obtains its nutrients from the female gametophyte. In the sporangium, diploid cells undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores. As the sporangium matures and dries out, its lid pops open. Spores spill out and are carried away by the wind. A spore settles on moist ground, germinates, and develops via mitosis into a thread-like haploid protonema, which resembles a green alga. The protonema eventually develops into a male or female gametophyte, completing the moss life cycle.
Okay, one of the other characteristics that plants and the charophytes had was multicellular dependent embryos. So I'm sorry, that we don't see in charophytes that are new to the plants. So remember, what we're doing is breaking down these 4 things that we see in land plants but not in charophytes, showing us that they are newer and have better adaptations. So alternation of generations is one. The next one is multicellular dependent embryos. So this embryo, it's a diploid embryo that's retained within tissue of the female gametophyte. So if you kind of relate this to humans, right, it's the embryo is held within our body, right? Nutrients are transferred from the parent embryo through placental transfer cells, much like it is in animals. And land plants are called embryophytes because of the dependency of the embryo on the parent. So, in the liverwort, which is related to moss, kind of a type of moss, you have the embryo here, and then the maternal tissue kind of on the outside, which is protecting it and feeding it. Third thing that we see walled spores produced in sporangia. These sporangia are these little organs that produce spores. So sporangia makes spores, and the spores are held inside of or produced inside the sporangia. Spore walls contain sporopollenin, which makes them resistant to harsh environments. Remember, that was an adaptation that we saw with plants in order to move onto land. So here you got the little sporangium and your spores. Another interesting thing that we see in plants that you do not see in charophytes are these apical meristems. So apical meristems are regions of the cell that are at the tips of the roots and at the shoots. And so you can get like in this picture here, you have shoot apical meristems and root apical meristems. The shoot being what shoots out of the ground, right? And they can divide throughout the plant's life. And so when you cut back plants in the winter time or after a freeze, it'll promote them to grow a little bit. It'll actually promote them to grow taller. So while it sounds kind of counterintuitive, it's kind of like when you have a lot of split ends on your hair, it's actually healthier to cut it, right, to allow it to grow because it's not splitting. So apical meristems are these areas either at the roots or the shoots where cell division occurs, and it can occur all throughout its life. Some additionally derived traits would include a cuticle, which is this waxy layer that covers the outside of a plant so that it prevents water loss. So when you see water accumulating on top, sitting on top of it, a lot of plants obviously are much waxier than other things are, but this helps prevent water loss and desiccation, and also microbial attack. And then we also have a thing in plants called a stomata, which is essentially a bunch of mouths, so that allows them to breathe. It allows them to push CO2 out and to suck oxygen in. And then in environments where it's extremely arid, they can keep their stomata closed until the nighttime, where they can push out all the CO2 they've accumulated and breathe in some oxygen during the cooler times and where the sun isn't going to suck all the moisture out of it. And so that's kind of these things that look like eyeballs in this blown up version of the plant. So the early plants that we know existed based on fossil records indicate that they were on land at least 470 million years ago, and we've been able to extract spores and tissues from rocks that are 450 million years ago, which is kind of interesting, especially since pollen is a pretty soft tissue. And as we learned previously, softer tissues are not going to provide us a whole lot of fossil record because most of it's going to just kind of decompose. We also know that 425 million years ago, large plant structures such as sporangium appeared in the fossil record. By about 400 million years ago, we had a diverse assemblage of plants that lived on land. And then some of the unique traits of these early plants included special tissue that allowed water to transport, so moving water from the soil up to the tip top of their roots, the cuticles that help them contain moisture, stomata that help them to breathe and also prevent them from desiccating, and then branched sporophytes. Okay, so moving on to concept 26.4, I'm not really going to test you on like you're not going to get a picture of a moss life cycle or a fern life cycle and ask what, to fill in the blank of what the things are. But what I do want you to understand is the basic concept of this alternation of generations. Now, in lab, hopefully you'll talk a whole lot more about the move from being a moss to being a fern, and then becoming seed plants like we're talking about. Mosses and ferns, while they are plants, are fairly primitive plants. So we have seed plants that have pollen grains, and these guys we know are younger. They originated about 360 million years ago, and they have a lot more adaptations, including this seed that allows them to be extremely diverse. They're found in a lot more habitats. We see seed plants everywhere, whereas you only see moss and you see ferns in certain environments, typically those that are extremely wet. So this seed, this concept of a new seed, consists of an embryo that is its food supply surrounded by a protective coat. So if you think about like the seed of an apple, if you were to bite that open or crack it open, you have the brown seed coat that surrounds it, and inside of it, it's kind of squishy. You could probably put your fingernail through it. It's a lot more tissue to it, and that's the food supply that is around the embryo. Mature seeds can be dispersed by many different ways. There's wind, insects. Some of them have special adaptations like sticker burrs so that they can stick to the fur of something and then move on to other things. So there's some pretty unique and very interesting adaptations by plants in order to disperse themselves. So the seed plants that are still alive, that are extant today, are divided into two clades. We have gymnosperms and we have angiosperms. Gymnosperms have naked seeds that they're not enclosed inside chambers, versus angiosperms, which have seeds that develop inside chambers called ovaries. And the way that these look, gymnosperms are like pine cones, pine trees, junipers, that kind of thing. They are also sago palms, and a number of other different types of palms. So while if you look at them or think about them, their leaf structure is quite a bit different than like an oak leaf or a maple tree or a fig tree or another fruiting tree. Angiosperms are those plants that flower, that produce a flower. There's pollen, there's seeds that are produced when pollen visits another flower. Some of these plants may not necessarily um, flower in a way that we recognize, like a big, huge, pretty flower, but even our oak trees will produce little teeny tiny flowers. Cedar elms will produce little teeny tiny flowers. A lot of bushes will produce flowers. Some plants have been so cultivated that they don't, like, for example, a lot of grasses, even if you allow them to grow really, really, really tall, will not seed. Um, but most things that are considered an angiosperm will. So in addition to these seeds, which are a huge adaptation, there's a couple of other things that are common to all seed plants. So now we see reduced gametophytes. If you think about the mosses, the gametophyte is what we know to be a moss. We now develop ovules and pollen. So gametophytes of seed plants are microscopic. They're not the parts that we see when you see mosses. And they develop from spores that are retained within the tissue of the parent sporophyte. So the sporophyte would be the flower, right? In an angiosperm. A parent sporophyte protects and provides nutrients to the developing gametophyte, to the new baby that's going to be born, the new seed that's being produced. An ovule consists of an egg-producing female gametophyte surrounded by a protective layer of sporophyte tissue called the integument. So the ovule being the seed, right? And then it's protected, it has a seed coat called the integument. And female gametophytes develop from these large megaspores. And one of the, if you look at, well, we're going to look at it in a second. But so we have our if we cut open a kiwi, the little seeds inside there are ovules. What's around it is actually the ovary. So when you eat fruit, you're eating the ovary of a fruit, of that plant, of that kiwi plant. And one of the adaptations, of course, that these plants have is this ovule that's very, very, very tasty, and that animal's going to eat it. And then when it goes to the bathroom, in its fecal material are going to be seeds, which it's now transferred to another location, right? The male gametophytes develop from small microspores, and we know these as pollen grains, right? So when you're allergic to cedar pollen, or whatever else it might be that you're allergic to, if it's any type of pollen, what you're literally allergic to is the sperm of a plant. So we eat the ovary, and we are allergic to the sperm of a plant. Pollination is the movement of pollen from one plant to the ovules in another plant. And when, of course, pollen and the egg are going to fuse, you're going to get a seed that is formed, which is the start of a new plant. Pollen eliminates the need for a film of water and can be dispersed great distances by air or animals. So all the other plants, ferns and mosses that we've looked at briefly before, required water to move male parts to female parts. But the development of a pollen grain, this dry little thing, now allows the pollen to be dispersed without depending on water anymore. And of course, we know that most pollen, its movement depends on insects, but there are other animals like bats and hummingbirds and even mice that will move pollen from one thing to another. Some plants are self-pollinated. They use their own pollen to fertilize their own egg, and then still other plants are wind pollinated. So evolutionary advantages of the seed. So the seed develops from the whole ovule. The seed is a sporophyte embryo along with its food supply, packaged in a protective coat. So the seed develops from a whole ovule. So the seed is the ovule, the fruit is the ovary that surrounds it. And although you might think that the ovary provides it with food, it's not. It's actually the inside of the seed coat that does. Seeds provide some evolutionary advantages over these spores that the other plants have had. So seeds are multicellular, whereas the spores are usually single-celled. So if something happens to go wrong or a part of it dies, probably not the whole entire seed may die. They are able to, and because of this, probably they're able to remain dormant from days to years even, until conditions are favorable to provide germination. So you take that dry bean, lima bean, and you stick it in the soil and water it, and it's going to start to germinate. How long was it dry before that? Who knows? But when you purchase seeds, they're usually very, very dry and desiccated. But once they're provided the moisture that is adequate for them, they'll start to germinate. Seeds also have a supply of store food, which spores do not have. So they are able to feed themselves. Early seed plants and the rise of the gymnosperms. So fossil evidence reveals that by the late Devonian period, some plants had begun to acquire features found in seed plants, but they didn't actually bear the seeds yet. So they're kind of making their way there. Gymnosperms appeared in the fossil record about 305 million years ago, and gymnosperms largely replaced lacophytes and ferns as the climate became drier toward the end of the Carboniferous period. So we start moving away from mosses into more gymnosperms. So we think that gymnosperms, or we know that gymnosperms are older, than angiosperms are. They developed first. They were a lot better suited for the non-vascular plants for these drier conditions due to their adaptations. So they had seed, they had pollen, they didn't require water, they had thicker cuticles, and their leaves had a smaller surface area, whereas mosses and things like that had a large surface area because they were kind of spread out all over the place. They really required water, and they didn't have the seed or the pollen. So we see gymnosperms in covering the earth everywhere, pretty much in every environment that you can imagine. So if we think of gymnosperms as pine trees, we usually think of them found in mountainous areas or areas where it's very, very cold, and there's a lot of snow. And one of the reasons why they do so well there is because of the way that their branches are. They aren't weighed down by a whole lot of snow. If it were to snow in San Antonio and it would land on all the oak trees, those oak trees would crack and crunch, and the branches wouldn't be able to sustain that intense weight. But gymnosperms are able to just have it kind of fall off of them without breaking their branches. However, you don't just find gymnosperms in cold environments. You find them in really arid environments, like with a lot of junipers or cedars. You find them in tropical environments, like you do with sago palms or other types of palms. And so they're an important part of the Earth's flora, making up living in vast regions all over the place. And of course, we call them conifer. The cone-bearing ones we call conifers. Pine cones are conifers. Whereas angiosperms, which are these seed plants, will reproduce. They have reproductive structures that we call flowers and fruits. And there are the most widespread and the most diverse of all the plants, if you think about it. A flower is an angiosperm structure that is specialized for sexual reproduction. Specialized for sexual reproduction because it's attractive to other animals to come to it because it smells good, it's pretty. It's attractive for insects especially to find it. And most of the species are pollinated by insects, while some of them are wind pollinated. So I want to say that the statistic is somewhere around 95 to 99% of flowering plants are not wind pollinated. They require an insect to pollinate them. And of the 200,000 species of animals that pollinate, only 1,000 are not insects. So the majority of flowers that are out there rely on an insect to pollinate them. A flower is a specialized shoot um, with up to 4 types of modified leaves called floral organs. So if I move up here, a sepal. So if you think about a rose, right before a rose opens up, a sepal are these little are like some people call them petal leaves. They're the leaves that cover up the petals, enclose the flower before it's ready to open. Petals are these brightly colored and usually very good smelling things that attract pollinators. Stamens are, this whole thing is a stamen, and this is the male part of the plant. It produces the pollen, whereas the carpel, which is this whole entire thing right here, is the female part of the plant. And the male part of the plant, the stamen, is made up of 2 things: an anther, which is where the pollen actually is, and a filament, which is a stick that basically moves it up in the air so that it's able to be pollinated. The female part of the plant, the carpel, is made up of 3 different things. The stigma, which is this really sticky top part that's going to stick to pollen. Pollen is going to stick to it as it flies through the air, or if it's on another insect and they land on it, they're going to grab the pollen. The style is kind of the shoot that when the pollen, little pieces of pollen stick here, it's going to travel down the style and into the ovary. Here are the little eggs that are going to fuse with the pollen that are going to start to develop, called the ovules, and the ovary. So ovules are found within the ovary, right? Which is a part of the carpel. And that's going to develop into a seed, whereas this ovary on the outside is going to develop into the fruit, if it is like an apple or another tree like that. So again, the stamen consists of a stalk called a filament with a sap called an anther where the pollen is produced. A carpel consists of an ovary at the base, a style that leads up to the stigma where the pollen is received. The stigma is sticky, and then the style is the slide that gets the pollen to get down. And the ovary will contain 1 or more ovules, which will become seeds. The flower may have 1 or more carpels. It doesn't necessarily just have 1, and the term pistil can be used for a single carpel or 2 or more fused carpels. Seeds develop from ovules after fertilization. The ovary wall thickens and matures to form a fruit. And the fruit protects the seeds and also aids in its dispersal because it's eaten and then the seeds come out of it, or you grab that apple as you're walking and they drop it someplace else. Think of a raccoon maybe that's picking up fig plants from a fig tree, is going to walk off somewhere probably and dump it. Various fruit adaptations help disperse seeds by wind, water, or animals. And so some of the ways they can do it is they can function as parachutes or propellers for wind dispersal. So think of like dandelions, or those, or sticker burrs, something like that. So sticker burrs cling to animals' fur, human clothing. While we don't consume that fruit, it's still considered a fruit. Or it's food that's carried in the digestive system, as I've mentioned, of animals with seeds passing unharmed when the animal defecates because of its good seed coat, that integument around it. So as far as angiosperm evolution goes, it's really kind of a mystery. Darwin called it an abominable mystery, and we just don't have a whole lot of information about it. We don't fully understand the evolution of angiosperms, but we can look at phylogenetic analysis and also some fossil evidence, which tells us that angiosperms originated at least 140 million years ago, and then they dominated the landscape by the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago. So they are really young things. But if you think about like Jurassic Park and when we imagine dinosaurs, we usually imagine them in these rainforests with this lush environment, lots and lots of plants, but also ferns and things. And so we believe that they were probably around during that time, especially since there were animals at that time that were herbivores. They're going to need to consume some fruit. Ancestors of angiosperms and gymnosperms diverged about 305 million years ago, and angiosperms probably are more closely related to extinct seed plants than they are actually to gymnosperms. So although they share things like a seed, they may not have shared an immediate common ancestor. I'll show you some pictures and tell you what these things are, but Amborella, which is like a shrub I think there's only like one species of it and they're found kind of in the Polynesian area, and water lilies, which you know probably what they are likely descended from two of the most ancient angiosperm lineages, whereas monocots and eudicots radiated off later on. So the Amborella and the water lilies kind of had a common ancestor, closest one over here, and then off of then the common ancestor between water lilies and everyone else kind of happened later. And monocots and eudicots are most likely the youngest ones. So this isn't necessarily going to be, you're going to be tested over this, but just so you know what these things are. Amborella is only one species. It's found in a small island to the east of Australia, and it's a shrub-like thing. So there's not many of them, and very, very considered to be relatively primitive. Water lilies, of course, you find them in aquatic habitats throughout the world. Since it requires water, it probably is older because it's still kind of holding on to that dependency on water, like the older plants are. Star anise. Anise is like licorice. Naturally occurs in Southeast Asia and southeastern United States. And the species that are still alive likely descended from ancestral populations that were separated by continental drift, since there's not really anything that connects Asia to the United States. Magnoliids, are magnolias, laurels, like mountain laurels, avocados, cinnamon, and black pepper, which is interesting. So you can say that magnolia trees are more closely related to cinnamon sticks or pepper than they are to sunflowers, which doesn't seems very unlikely, but it is. So those things are magnoliids are older things. Monocots account for more than a quarter of angiosperm species. Monocots are like dates, actually a lot of palms, a lot of like large palms that you would see on the beach. So there's like sago palms, which are conifers, but the term palm is kind of misleading there. I guess that's the problem with having common names. And then eudicots, which used to be called dicots, but eudicots are most flowering plants that you look at are called eudicots. These are fruits and vegetables and trees and shrubs and lots of flowers. Monocots are grasses and palms mainly.